The coffee was already cold by the time my brother finished his toast. That detail stayed with me longer than it should have. I'd driven an hour and 20 minutes from my apartment in Ashford to my parents' house in Millbrook, brought a lemon pound cake from the bakery on Route 9 that my mother had mentioned wanting to try, and arrived 15 minutes early because I knew parking on their street got impossible once all the relatives showed up. I remember setting the cake box on the counter and noticing that nobody said anything about it. Not a word. My aunt walked past it 3 times. It was Thanksgiving, and the house smelled the way it always did in November. Roasting garlic, that particular brand of dish soap my mother had used my entire life, and the faint mustiness of the guest room blankets she dragged out once a year. My cousins were in the living room. My brother was at the kitchen table reading something on his phone. My father was doing that thing he did at every family gathering where he stood near the food with a glass of wine, looking like he had personally invented the concept of the holidays. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat down. My mother came in from the back hallway with the energy of someone who had been rehearsing something. I recognized it immediately. She had a particular brightness when she was saving news, the kind that made her movements a little too deliberate, her eye contact a little too even. She asked if everyone could come to the living room for a minute because she and my father had an announcement. I picked up my coffee. I followed. The announcement was that my brother was going back to school. Not just any school. He had been accepted to a graduate program in Austin, an MBA, 2 years, full residential, starting in January. My parents had helped him research programs, helped him with the application, helped him prepare for the interviews. The whole room was hearing this for the first time, apparently, because my aunts pressed their hands to their chests, and my uncle started talking about what a great city Austin was, and my brother sat in the armchair the way he always sat in armchairs, like he had been placed there by a director. He was 31. He had a communications degree he had never really used, a string of jobs that never quite worked out, and a general quality of existing in the world that my parents had always described as figuring things out. He was charming and funny and genuinely difficult to be angry at, which I think was the most exhausting thing about him. I waited for the natural pause that comes after applause and asked how the program was being funded. My mother looked at me with the expression she reserved for questions she considered slightly beside the point. She said the tuition and living expenses were being covered, that it was all sorted, that this was a moment to be happy for your brother. I asked again, specifically. I asked whether the money was coming from their savings or from the account. She said the account. I want to explain what the account was because it mattered, and because the way it came to exist was so gradual that by the time it had become something significant, nobody in my family seemed to think of it as anything unusual. I was 24 when I got my first real job. Healthcare revenue cycle management, which sounds abstract but basically means I worked with hospitals and insurance companies to make sure billing was processed correctly. It was not glamorous. It paid well because it required precision, and precision was something I happened to be good at. Within 2 years, I was managing a small team. By 27, I had been promoted twice and was pulling a salary that my friends in other fields found faintly alarming when it came up. My parents were not in crisis exactly, but they were stretched. My father had retired earlier than planned because of a back problem that made his old construction management job impossible, and his pension was smaller than they'd expected. My mother worked part-time at a dental office. They owned their house, but the property taxes had gone up 3 years in a row and the furnace needed replacing, and there was always something. I set up a joint savings account when I was 26. I put myself and my mother on it. My father couldn't manage the online interface easily, and we decided my mother would be the practical access point. I contributed to it every month. I told them it was for emergencies, a buffer, something to draw from so they didn't have to carry stress they didn't need to carry. I thought of it as a structural solution. That was how my mind worked. Identify the recurring problem, build something that addresses it without requiring repeated negotiation. Over time, the account became something else. It paid for my brother's car when his transmission failed and he was working a delivery job in Raleigh. It covered my father's dental work when his insurance lapsed in the transition to retirement. It helped my cousin with first and last month's rent when she was moving out of a bad situation. None of these things were discussed with me ahead of time. They were simply handled. The money was there. My mother had access. Problems got solved. What I noticed, slowly, was that the account had stopped being an emergency buffer and started being a general family operating fund. My parents talked about it at the table the way people talk about a household appliance, as infrastructure, as a given, as something that had always been there and would always be there. My brother referred to it once, in passing, as the family money, and nobody corrected him. I had never corrected him either. That was on me. What I had not done, in 6 years of contributing to that account, was remove my mother's access, not because I couldn't. The bank's online system had a straightforward authorization management process. I had set it up, I understood it, I could have changed it any time. I hadn't because there had never been a reason to, until that Thursday in November, sitting in my parents' living room while my relatives congratulated my brother on his acceptance to a program I had just learned existed, being funded by money I had spent 6 years building, for a future that nobody had thought to mention to me until it was already decided. I did not say anything immediately. I sat with my coffee and let the conversation happen around me. My mother was talking about Austin apartments. My uncle was talking about barbecue. My brother was showing someone something on his phone. I waited until there was a natural lull, the way there always is, before people drift toward the kitchen. I said, conversationally, that I wanted to make sure I understood the numbers correctly. I asked my mother what the current balance in the account was and whether the full 2 years of tuition and expenses had already been committed. She named a figure. It was most of what I had contributed over the past 18 months. I nodded. I said I wanted to make sure they had what they needed because there was something about that account I thought they should understand before they made any further commitments. My mother gave me a look that was half patient, half warning. I said it very simply. I said the account was in my name. My mother had authorized access, which meant she could view and withdraw, but the account itself, the ownership, the ability to modify who had access, that was mine alone. And I said that I was going to be making a change. I opened my banking app. It took less than 45 seconds. I removed my mother's authorized access and transferred the current balance into a separate individual account I had opened 2 weeks earlier, just in case, just so I wasn't acting in a moment of pure impulse with nowhere for the money to go. I set the phone face down on my knee. My mother's phone buzzed. She picked it up. She read the notification and went very still in the specific way that she went, still when she was deciding which version of herself to be in the next 10 seconds. My father looked over. She showed him her screen. He looked up at me. "What did you just do?" he said. Not a question exactly. I told him what I had done. I said it clearly and without any particular emotion, because by that point I had moved through the emotion and arrived somewhere quieter. I said the account had been used to fund a 2-year graduate program for my brother without my knowledge or consent. I said I understood that they may have thought of the money as communal, as something that simply existed for the family's needs. But I said that was a misunderstanding of what the account actually was. My brother stood up from the armchair. He said my name. He said what is happening. He said this is insane. I looked at him. I said that I was genuinely happy for him, that an MBA from a good program was a real opportunity, and that I hoped he found a way to fund it. I said I'd be glad to talk through options with him if that would help. Then I stood up, folded the throw blanket that had been sitting next to me on the couch. I don't know why I did that, habit maybe, or the need to do something with my hands, and I went to the kitchen, put on my coat, picked up my purse, and walked out. My father followed me to the driveway. He said things I don't need to repeat here. His voice had the particular quality it got when he was angry but wasn't sure he was right, which made it oscillate between volume and control in a way that was hard to listen to. I told him I loved him. I got in my car. I sat there for a minute before starting the engine, not thinking about anything in particular. The air through the slightly cracked window was cold and smelled like dead leaves in the neighbor's fireplace. Then I drove home. The calls started that night. My brother called 4 times before midnight. My mother texted a sequence of messages that began with shock and moved through hurt and arrived at something that looked, from the outside, like moral authority. She wrote about family loyalty and the importance of being there for each other during important transitions, and how she had never thought I could be capable of something like this. My father called once, left a voicemail, did not call again. My aunt, who I had always been close to, sent a long message that was more measured and more painful than the others, because she actually tried to understand my side before explaining why she thought I was wrong. I read it 3 times. I didn't respond for a week. Nobody, in any message, in any medium, acknowledged the thing that had happened at that table. Nobody said, "We should have told you." Nobody said, "We should have asked." The conversation in every message was about my reaction, not about what I was reacting to. That was the part that settled something in me. I had spent a decade being useful. I want to be precise about that word because it matters. Not loved. I think my family loved me in their way. But useful. I was the one who answered calls when things went wrong. I was the one with the stable job, the organized finances, the ability to solve problems that required patience and attention to detail. I was the one who drove an hour each way to be at family things and always brought something and never made a fuss about the logistics. I had built myself into a function that the family relied on so completely that the function had become invisible, not me, the function, the money, the stability, the reliability. Those things were simply assumed, the way you assume the electricity will work when you flip a switch. The comment at Thanksgiving wasn't the thing that broke me. I want to be clear about that. What broke me, or more accurately, what finally cracked something open that had been sealed shut for a long time, was realizing how little the announcement had cost anyone. My mother had said, "It's all sorted," with complete comfort. My brother had sat in that armchair without a trace of uncertainty. My father had stood near the food with his glass of wine looking satisfied. None of them had paused. None of them had looked at me first. Because they hadn't needed to. That was the answer. They hadn't needed to look at me first, because looking at me first had never been part of the process. I was infrastructure. Infrastructure doesn't need to be consulted. In the months that followed, I did not participate in any family financial support. No contributions to the account, no, "Hey, I can help with that," no emergency interventions. I was cordial. I showed up to things that mattered. I sent birthday cards and asked about people's lives. But the version of me that was also the family's silent financial backstop, that version simply stopped showing up. The way a service stops being available when you let the subscription lapse. The remarkable thing was how manageable everything turned out to be. The crises that had always seemed to require my involvement stopped arriving. Not because the problems stopped, but because the problems found other solutions, the way water finds another path when one is closed. My brother deferred his program start by a semester, found a combination of student loans and a part-time employer sponsorship, and enrolled in January of the following year. My parents renegotiated their home equity line. Things were tighter than they'd been. Nobody starved. I started seeing a therapist around this time, not because I was falling apart, I wasn't, but because I had a persistent sense that I had been living inside a story about myself that I hadn't written and couldn't quite identify. She was methodical and specific and didn't use the kind of language that makes therapy feel like a self-help podcast. She mostly asked questions and waited for me to follow my own thread. One afternoon, she asked me whether I thought I had ever confused being needed with being valued. I thought about that for a while. I said I wasn't sure. I thought maybe I had understood, somewhere beneath the practical surface of things, that the two were different. But I had made a quiet decision at some point to treat them as interchangeable, because being valued required someone else to choose it. Being needed was something I could engineer. She nodded. She said that was worth sitting with. I'm still sitting with it. There are people who will read this and say I overreacted, that my brother's education was genuinely important, that family support is supposed to be unconditional and I was keeping score. Maybe. But there's a version of unconditional that is actually just unacknowledged, and those are not the same thing. I was never asked to contribute. I was never thanked in any formal or deliberate way. The arrangement existed because I had made it exist, and then nobody had ever looked directly at it. The morning after I drove home from Millbrook, I woke up earlier than usual and made coffee and sat at my kitchen table and watched the light change on the buildings across the street. I had lived in my apartment for 3 years, and I don't think I had ever just sat there doing nothing in the morning. I was always moving towards something, scheduling something, preparing for something. That morning I just sat. I thought about the pound cake I had left on my parents' counter. I wondered if anyone had eaten it. I thought about how I had been 15 minutes early because I cared about the parking. I thought about my aunt's message and the specific phrase she had used, the person we rely on, as though that were a compliment, as though that were the thing anyone would want most to be described as. The person we rely on. I have a savings account now with one authorized user. Me. I made my first solo trip 6 months ago. A long weekend in New Mexico. A place I had wanted to visit for years and had never gotten around to because there was always something else. Always somewhere the money was more needed. Always a reason to put it off. I hiked on my first morning there and came back to the trailhead, dusty and a little sunburned, and sat on the tailgate of the rental car eating a gas station sandwich and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. I couldn't name it exactly. Not happiness exactly. More like presence. Being somewhere because I had chosen to be there, for no reason except that I had wanted to. I called my brother last month. It was a short call. He's doing well in Austin. He didn't bring up Thanksgiving. Neither did I. We talked about a show we'd both been watching and about our father's hip, which has been giving him trouble. It was fine, ordinary. The kind of call you have when things aren't repaired but they aren't broken either. Just different, resettled into a new shape. I don't know what I am to my family now. Not the function I was. Not the infrastructure. Something smaller maybe, and more mine. I think about that drive home sometimes. The highway at night, the radio off, the specific quality of silence when you've made a decision and the decision is behind you. I had thought I would feel worse than I did. I thought there would be more grief in it. There was some. I won't say there wasn't. But underneath it was something I hadn't expected. Something that felt, strangely, like relief. Like putting down a bag you've been carrying for so long you had stopped noticing the weight, and then feeling the absence of it in your shoulders, in your back, in the whole way your body moves through the world. I still bring dessert to family things, old habits. Last month I brought a chocolate layer cake from the same bakery on Route 9 and my aunt said it was the best thing she'd eaten all year. I said thank you. I had a piece. I went home at a reasonable hour. Have you ever been the person a family builds its plans around without ever once asking if that was okay with you? The person whose yes was assumed so completely that the question was never bothered with? And if you have, did you stay? Did you let the assumption keep being true? Or did you, one ordinary Thursday, finally decide that your money, your time, and your presence were yours to offer and not anyone else's to simply take? I've thought a lot about what it actually costs to be the reliable one, not the financial cost, though that was real. 6 years of consistent contributions, a number I could tell you exactly because I tracked everything in a spreadsheet I updated every month. I mean the other cost. The one that doesn't show up anywhere. The cost of being so dependable that people stop registering you as a person who might have needs of her own and start registering you as a system that simply runs. That Thanksgiving when my mother said, "It's already sorted," with that particular ease in her voice, she wasn't being cruel. I want to be honest about that. She wasn't calculating or malicious. She was just comfortable. And that comfort had been built, slowly and quietly, over years of me making things work without being asked, without complaint, without ever once saying, "Wait, did anyone think to check with me first?" The cause was there long before the effect arrived at that dinner table. Every time I solved the problem without naming what it cost me, I was teaching my family something. I was teaching them that my resources were available, that my boundaries were flexible, that my yes was a standing offer that didn't need to be renewed. I taught them that thoroughly enough that by the time my brother's graduate school funding was being decided, my name didn't even come up as a question. It came up as an answer. That's not something I can blame entirely on them. That part is on me. What I understand now, in a way I didn't when I was 26 and setting up that account and feeling genuinely good about being able to help. What I understand now is that there is a difference between generosity and invisibility. Generosity is a choice you make consciously, with full information, in a direction that feels true to you. Invisibility is what happens when generosity goes unacknowledged long enough that it stops being seen as a gift and starts being seen as a feature of the landscape. I had crossed that line years before that Thursday. I just hadn't looked at it directly. The thing about taking that step, removing the access, transferring the balance, sitting in my car in the driveway before driving home, is that it required something I had been quietly avoiding for a long time. It required me to be willing to be seen as the difficult one, the ungrateful one, the one who chose money over family, as my mother's messages suggested. That framing hurt. It still does a little if I'm being honest. But I had spent so many years being the easy one, the accommodating one, the one who made things smooth. And where had that gotten me? To a living room where my brother's future was being announced with my money and my name was nowhere in the conversation. Clarity is not always comfortable when it arrives, but it is useful. I think about Owen sometimes, about whether he understands yet what was actually being handed to him that day. Not just the tuition, but the lesson underneath it. That someone else's financial stability is not a resource you get to plan around without asking. I hope he figures that out. I think he's getting there. And I think about the version of me who drove to Millbrook 15 minutes early with a lemon pound cake and expected nothing except maybe a thank you, and how she had been doing that, in some form, for years. She deserved better. Not from them, necessarily. From herself. That's the thing nobody tells you about finally standing up for yourself inside a family dynamic that has spent years organizing itself around your silence. It doesn't feel like victory. It feels like grief and relief at the same time, in equal measure, and you just have to sit with both until they settle into something you can live with. I'm living with it. Some days that's enough. Most days lately, it's more than enough.